This is Chatter. I'm Shane Harris. This week, journalist Annie Jacobsen on a scenario for nuclear war.
You know, the fundamental reason for me writing this book was to show in appalling detail just how horrific nuclear war would be. So many of these Cold Warriors explain to me how this is a fundamental fear, that once nuclear launch begins, it ends in only one way, which is nuclear Armageddon. There are so many weapons ready for launch. America has 1,770. Russia has 1,674. This is the precipice. This is the razor's edge. Do we really want to live like this?
Annie Jacobsen, welcome to Chatter. It is a delight to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we were just talking before we came on. I feel like you and we are in such similar parallel worlds, and we have never actually had the chance to talk to one another. So this is really a treat for me. So thanks for coming on.
And for me as well, we report on very similar veins of national security and government secrecy.
Yeah, totally. And you've just decided after writing about, military history in Area 51, why not the light topic of nuclear war?
That's right.
And I have to say, as authors, we often hope for a moment where a topic is going to hit and land just right. And sadly, terrifyingly, I think that your book has hit at a moment that we are having right now where the threat of this just unimaginable horror is all in the front of our minds for more reason than one right now.
I mean, when I began reporting the book, the elder statesmen of the Cold War, who held very senior positions in nuclear command and control, were very forthcoming with me because there seemed to be a forgotten idea about how perilous our nuclear arsenals have us all. And now, my God, who wants Vladimir Putin to be doing press for their book, which is, it feels like what is happening because there is so much dangerous saber rattling going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so true. Well, the title of your book is Nuclear War, a Scenario, which is a title that implies, of course, a hypothetical nuclear war, which you lay out in the pages of this book in a kind of minute by minute and in some cases second by second account of how it would play out. And you are taking readers inside the White House, inside the bunkers at places like Raven Rock, this alternate site where the U.S. leadership would retreat if we were under attack, to bunkers in Russia and North Korea, to the doomsday planes circling in the sky, giving launch orders to U.S. forces. It is this just detailed blow by blow of how this war that lasts basically less than an hour would actually play out. So as a first question, why did you write this? Why did you want to write this book? And what gave you the idea for this format of taking it scene by scene, this step by step like this?
Mm-hmm. So having written 6 books previously on, military and intelligence programs, the CIA, the Pentagon, DARPA, and on, I have interviewed scores, literally hundreds of people who've dedicated their lives to national security, and what they say to me often with a sense of pride, keeping nuclear World War III from happening. And when you look at histories and you look at some of history's sort of more, maybe even objectionable wars and missions, I always try to report on the flip side of that the argument is this prevented nuclear World War III. And so in my mind, I began to wonder as I heard this phrase over and over again, what would happen if deterrence or prevention failed? What would that look like? And during the previous administration, when President Trump was in office, and there was so much rhetoric coming out of the mouth of a president, the likes of which I had never seen before. And I noticed people like Stratcom commanders going on the record talking about this, and this is in air quotes. We can get into this later. This meaning the whole idea of potentially launching a nuclear weapon. And that really motivated me to get on the phone with my longtime sources and begin reporting the idea, what would happen if deterrence failed. I was stunned that many of these Cold Warriors jumped right in and began to explain to me what would happen.
And so many of them went on the record with you, which I took as a real sign that they wanted to convey to people how very serious this is. And you can't escape it in the course of your narrative. It's so vivid. I mean, we're talking down to the level of, knowing precisely which protocol gets initiated and which plane takes the command and which system at which base. I mean, they really went into extraordinary detail about this, didn't they?
Absolutely. And I knew that I needed that because, well, for two reasons. One, because the book is nonfiction. It's called, one of the reviewers called it dystopian nonfiction.
I love that.
And so it's a hypothetical scenario, but it is fact-based with the woulds and the coulds, because don't forget, this is what the Pentagon does in its war game scenario. And those war game scenarios happen with incredible frequency that none of us have even any access to whatsoever. And so the book takes the reader right up to the edge of what can actually be known by the public.
And what were some of the sources, in addition to these people you talked to, that were helpful for you in the book? I mean, the research it's extensive, and you chronicle a ton of it in the end notes. But I'm reading this thinking like, my God, where did she find that? I mean, down to protocols for when a security team with the president, if he were being evacuated in Marine One, would strap them onto their bodies and parachute him out of the helicopter if they needed to. So what were some of the other materials that you dove into to fleshing out the story?
I mean, so let's talk about that one, because it's a great example, I think. And the mind of the reporter is so curious, as you know. And so you begin saying, you learn one bit of information. You learn about Raven Rock from, say, Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, who calls it the alternate National Military Command Center. And then you learn, oh, that's the official title of it. And then you can dig deeper into archives to find out information there. But the president being, helicoptered out of the White House to a nuclear bunker in the minutes and seconds after he is briefed that a nuclear missile is on the way is an extraordinary bit of tension. And I got that information from Secret Service agents retired who are on what is called the CAT team, which is the president's, the Secret Service paramilitary team, which is almost unknown, which I had reported on in another book about the CIA's paramilitary, because they kind of borrow operators from one another. So you find out, bit by bit, again, not classified information, just up to the edge of what can be known. But from there, from those interviews, come remarkable details. Like this one, for example, was that I was talking to someone who was a former special agent in charge of the president's detail, and he was filling in the information that I'd gotten from a CAT team operator who said, oh, well, actually, that specific team is called the Element. And the Element would have to XYZ as I take the reader through the book. And then I realized there would be this delay, because the parachutes to parachute the president out of Marine One are not, at least not now, presently in the helicopter and have to be retrieved from the White House office. And that's like a couple minute detour. And when you're talking about this ticking clock in seconds and minutes, as a reporter, you suddenly realize that's a really legit piece of information. And I want to drill down on that. And then you begin asking more questions. Then you realize, oh my God, there's a conflict between the idea of STRATCOM, U.S. Strategic Command, for listeners who aren't familiar with that, the most important organization in the event of a nuclear war, that STRATCOM desperately wants orders from the president. And the Secret Service team desperately wants to get the president to safety because that is their job. So you see these inner conflicts, and those themselves become incredibly dramatic, and as a reporter, lead to more questions.
Yeah, and it creates this, as you alluded to, this incredible narrative tension, because you realize as the reader, every one of these little detours and disagreements and misunderstandings is wasting time. And we'll get into here in a bit of just how every one of those seconds counts so preciously. I don't want to give away everything in the book because it really does read like a novel. And so there are just these wonderful twists and turns, and we won't go through every scene. But I think it's probably people should know, at least to start, that in your scenario, it's North Korea that strikes first with this initially single launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile towards Washington, which then sets in motion the apocalyptic chain of events that you're describing in this harrowing detail. So why did you choose North Korea as the instigator? I mean, you could have chosen any number of different scenarios, the U.S. firing first, Russia. Why did you go with this as the sort of the starting point?
Mm-hmm. Once I made the decision that I wasn't going to get involved in the politics of a lead up, the sort of national security moving and positioning, as many people do and have done well, I was simply going to begin like from nuclear launch and take you through nuclear winter with an intro that sets up how we got to this point in time with specific regard to nuclear weapons, with nuclear buildup, but not nations at war or nations in conflict. And so it made the most sense, based on a number of interviews that I did, to begin that way. Andrew Weber, who served as President Obama's an advisor to him for nuclear weapons, one of the highest advisors in his cabinet on nuclear weapons, told me that a bolt out of the blue attack is what Washington fears most. And that means an unwarned attack just coming in. It's like a 9/11 or a Pearl Harbor. And so, there would be a lot of posturing involved, one would think, were it to be a long-standing rival like Russia or like China. But with the sort of precarious nature of North Korea, and with North Korea being the only nuclear-armed power that does not announce its ballistic missile launches, which I was shocked to learn.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, all the other nations do, because no one wants to start a nuclear war by accident, except North Korea. And so that gave me a very reportable, I believe, idea that this was a legitimate scenario, and almost certainly something the Pentagon has war gamed out, a sense that was only confirmed by my interviews. And the final icing on the cake for why I chose North Korea had to do with my interview with Richard Garwin. And listeners not familiar with him, he is arguably the world's expert on thermonuclear weapons. Why? Because he drew the plans of the original Ivy Mike thermonuclear weapon, which was exploded in the Marshall Islands in 1952. People think Edward Teller invented the, hydrogen thermonuclear bomb. Well, Richard Garwin drew the plans because Teller could only conceive it theoretically. And this was only recently reported because it was classified for so long. And it was Richard Garwin who told me, he's in his 90s now, and we did a number of interviews for the book. He told me that what he fears most, I'm paraphrasing, he doesn't use those words, is an attack by a madman.
Mm-hmm.
Just an absolute rogue launch that no one knows why, and no one ever will. That is terrifying to me.
Yeah, I felt the same way in this and throughout the book, wanting to know why have they done this? And and I too was struck by what you reported, that North Korea does not announce these launches in advance, and you spend a lot of time in the beginning of the book describing the satellite system that the United States has that allows the United States to know when one of those missile tests is actually going to, maybe go up and come down in the ocean and not towards, the continental United States. Do you want to just say a word about the advanced technology the U.S. has to know pretty quickly upon launch where these missiles are actually going to be headed, which is absolutely crucial information?
Yes, and thank you for bringing that up, because those kinds of specific technological understandings are really interesting to me, both as a reporter and as a member of society, right? Because one of the reasons that this issue is not discussed, I believe, is because it becomes obfuscated by sort of highbrow, oh, you don't know, oh, leave this to the experts, oh, et cetera, et cetera. And I find that really abhorrent, because it's at the peril of all of us. And so what I always aim to do is talk to the smartest guys in the room, meaning the people who know the most about these systems, like Garwin, and then ask them, please explain it to me like you would explain it to your grandmother or your grandson. Why? Because most people are laymen, right? And they just need to know the basics. And they're so much smarter than any of us are smarter once we are armed with some really basic information. So to answer your question, this satellite system is shocking. Like, Lockheed has a system in space called SBIRS. That stands for Space-Based Infrared Satellite System. It's pretty basic, except for it's so advanced. It's like, I call it the 21st century Paul Revere. Okay. Instead of the British are coming, it's like the North Koreans are coming. And not only that, this space system, these satellites are parked over adversaries like North Korea to watch specifically for a nuclear launch 24/7, 365 days a year. That itself is remarkable. And the SBIRS system can detect launch within a fraction of a second. This is remarkable. And then you can think, as a reader or as a reporter, you visualize, okay, wow, up in space, 1/10 of the way to the moon, by the way. This data is now being massively processed and sent down to Earth. And then I take the reader, through where precisely it goes. Again, just having reported, it's a hunt, it's a journey. Wait, where does it go? Let's find out. Oh, it goes to the Aerospace Data Center in Colorado. What is that? Oh, that whole place was classified until 2008. No wonder the people don't know about that, right? And then you see how Space Force plays a role. And then you see how NORAD plays a role. And then how the information goes to the Pentagon. And this is all happening in seconds. And that's where you begin to realize, whoa, none of us may know this is going on, but it is going on. The plans and preparations for nuclear war, if it happens, are set. That's what I show in the book.
Yeah, yeah, and really how crucial it is for these people making these decisions to know, where this missile is likely to go. And, and there are moments I will say in the beginning of the book where it almost feels hopeful, like, oh, they know where it's going. Maybe they can do something. And it doesn't always necessarily work out that way. There's a really important policy that you highlight very early on in this story called launch on warning. Tell us about what that U.S. policy is and why it's so crucial to understanding how a scenario like this would play out.
Yes, exactly. And the launch on warning is actually built into the part of your question I didn't answer, which I'm going to answer now, which is, how do we know precisely where this missile is heading? And when I say we, of course, I mean the U.S. Defense Department. And so to begin with, this policy, which surprised me when I learned it, launch on warning, is exactly like it sounds. if the United States learns that a nuclear weapon is on the way, we launch on that warning. We do not wait. That was confirmed to me in the book by former Secretary of Defense William Perry. He says, like, we do not wait, period. Because, there's also a lot of chatter about, oh, no, we really don't have that policy. Well, we do. And the reason for that policy has to do with how fast everything happens in nuclear war. That the reason the launch on warning policy exists is because it takes approximately 30 minutes for a ballistic missile to arrive. And the idea is the president must launch a counterattack so that our nuclear command and control isn't taken out, which itself is like an oxymoron or a catch-22. And so to answer your earlier questions, as a reporter learning and then taking the reader through this in the book, wow, oh my God, like within seconds, the Defense Department can determine it's heading not toward Moscow, it's coming toward, this is out of looking at the missile launching out of Pyongyang. And then within minutes determining that it's not heading toward Hawaii, it's heading toward the continental United States. And then making decisions quickly, simultaneously waiting for what's called secondary confirmation, which is required for the counterattack to actually move forward. So it's the first warning is the satellite system, and the second warning comes from a ground-based system of radars that have been in place from the earliest days of the Cold War. And that happens around 8 or 9 minutes. Those systems in Alaska, in my scenario, confirm, yes, this is a missile and it is heading toward the United States. And then it becomes all about counterattack.
When North Korea launches tests a ballistic missile, I mean, do we imagine, or do you know that the kind of the spinning up of activity that happens in your book before they've actually confirmed it's for real coming to the U.S., does something like that happen when the cyber system sees just a missile test and everyone kind of is like on ready alert and watching it every second and minute as it goes?
Everyone is on ready alert all the time for exactly that reason. And like, here's another little jingle that was like, wow, our presence in South Korea, the U.S. military in South Korea, is also on alert all the time. I mean, their motto is ready to fight tonight. So they're not kidding. I mean, this is a constant eyes on situation. And what I really found fascinating was this idea that North Korea has launched 100 missiles since January of 2022. So when you think about that question you just asked, like, wait, are people on this all the time? Like, yes, they are, with good reason. Because it's only going to be a matter of seconds when that determination comes. No, wait a minute, this is not a satellite launch, which would be clearly heading, straight upwards in layman's terms, right? Very different than having a trajectory that suggests it's moving in another direction.
I don't think I'll ever be able to see a news alert or a CNN alert, or whatever, that North Korea tests another missile, which we kind of now have become used to. Oh, they're testing missiles again, without now like my stomach dropping and thinking, my God, what's been going on in those awful seconds and minutes as people have been watching this? Because every time it could be the real one. And it's just, and that launch on warning policy, I mean, it feels like this point of no return almost, and do the Russians, I think you read in the book, claim that they don't have a launch on warning policy, but we think they probably do. Is that right? Or what's the answer to that?
Good catch on that. And that is really important, And so throughout the Cold War, Soviet Russia always maintained that it did not have a launch on warning policy. And people differ in their opinions. My read on that is, well, that's great to sound as if they are somehow the noble ones. And you can talk to world's experts on the Soviet arsenal, as I did, to to learn more and to be able to contemplate other perspectives and make sure you're not just thinking about this from, the American point of view. But all that goes out the window when you learn that just recently, Putin publicly announced a change in that policy, publicly confirmed that Russia would launch nuclear missiles were it to learn of the missile's trajectory. That was the word he used, trajectory. And so that's making it very clear that he's actually talking about exactly what you and I have been talking about, when the satellite system determines that a missile is on the way. And of course, now from reading the book that, as I was shocked to learn, Russia's version of Sibers is called Tundra because, of course, parity, meaning we in Russia have to have like equal measure on all things nuclear, except for what experts almost universally agree is that Russia's satellite system is extremely faulty. And in the words of missile expert and professor emeritus at MIT, Ted Postel, the system is so bad that they misinterpret, sunlight for hot rocket exhaust, clouds for hot rocket exhaust. And as a result, Postel said, there could be this spasmodic launch of Russia's arsenal in error, which is precisely the kind of thing that happens in nuclear war scenario, because so many of these, Cold Warriors explain to me how this is a fundamental fear, that once nuclear launch begins, it ends in only one way, which is nuclear Armageddon.
I was reading the book and I wondered, and I don't know if you'll know the answer to this, but did anyone in the U.S. defense establishment ever consider, giving the Russians the equivalent technology that we do? Because, I won't go into detail about the book, but it's a very important part of your scenario that the Russian technology is not as good at seeing where the missiles are going as the U.S. technology. And I'm reading that thinking, my God, just give them the satellites so that we don't stumble into an apocalypse because their glasses aren't as well ground as ours, basically.
You're absolutely right. And one of the most astonishing sort of anecdotes I came across in reporting this was Garwin and Postel telling me about how they had proposed a kind of situation that you're suggesting, and it wasn't specific to the Tundra satellites, it was more specific to a drone system parked near North Korea that would be able to shoot down a ballistic missile while the missile was still in what's called boost phase, the first 5 minutes of launch, where it can be seen because there's rocket exhaust. And Postel and Garwin, who are very highly placed and can have access to people who can make decisions about these things, shared with me the very long paper that they wrote proposing this. This was back in the early 2000s, proposing that Russia and the United States partner up because they together had a vested interest in not seeing North Korea, become the nuclear superpower that it is now clearly becoming. But those words fell on deaf ears.
Jeez. Well, once a president is briefed on a missile or missiles heading towards the U.S., where the Defense Department has confirmed, yes, this is not a test, it's heading towards a target in the U.S., you write that he has 6 minutes to respond to that. Why is that window so short?
Well, first of all, the window within which the ballistic missile is going to arrive is 30 minutes, okay? And if you add a sub-launched ballistic missile in there, which I do, we won't spoil it for readers, that becomes even dramatically less time. So 6-minute window in 30 minutes, it's like a reasonable amount of time of that pie. People report it differently. People say the president is given different windows, 6 minutes, 10 minutes. The reason I chose 6 minutes was because I could source it specifically to President Reagan. And that I think is significant for readers because they're always going to be asking questions like, wait a minute, how do we know this? And of course, there's so much information now where we are in the world, and one would not want a fundamental concept dismissed over metrics, right? As important as numbers are. And so when in his memoirs, President Reagan describes this 6-minute window that a president has to make a decision to unleash Armageddon. Like, those are his words. And he even says that this is irrational. And he's right. And yet, that was 40 some odd years ago. As I write in the book, that 6-minute window kind of goes out the window once you have the Secret Service CAT team saying, wait, never mind Stratcom orders. We're getting the president out of the White House first because it's very close to the target, which is the Pentagon. So you can see the kind of extraordinary multiple parallel lines of stress all occurring at the same time. We haven't even begun to talk about FEMA, which is the organization in charge of allegedly taking care of the people after a nuclear war. And to have been able to have done the interviews I did with Craig Fugate, who is Obama's head of FEMA for all those years. Wow. I mean, what he said shocked me.
What were some of the things that he told you about FEMA's response that was most surprising to you?
Well, after we went through the population protection planning idea of things, which is what FEMA does for hurricanes, for earthquakes, he explained to me that the FEMA prepares for nuclear war. And they call it, he even said to me, we prepare for asteroids, right? So your mind is like in this dramatic space already. And he said that these events, asteroids and nuclear war, are called low probability, high consequence events. And then he went on to say that after a nuclear war, there wouldn't be any public protection planning, because everyone would be dead. That's his quote. And when I went back to him for multiple interviews, I even was like, did I hear, just to triple confirm. And he stuck with it. And I'm so glad he did, because I said, what should people do? And he said, hope that you have Pedialyte stocked. Don't forget your morals. And so, again, he underscored for me this idea that, nuclear war is insane. And so, yes, deterrence is great if it works. But I even found a quote from the deputy commander of Stratcom talking to a group inside the organization saying, if deterrence fails, everything unravels. And that unraveling is what I describe in the book.
You talk about in really vivid detail what the effect of a nuclear explosion is. And it's very hard to read, and a lot of people will find it disturbing, but I think it's so important that people truly do understand what this blast does. And you talk about these blast radiuses of like ring 1 and then ring 2 and things that are outside of it. So where I'm speaking to you from now, where I live, I'm in ring 1 in Washington. I'm 2 miles as the crow flies roughly from the Capitol and about 5 miles from the Pentagon. So if a nuclear bomb goes off here, tell me what that looks like.
You, Shane, become combusting carbon, right? So you have been spared the horror of third-degree burns, which for the most part require limb amputation. And without limb amputation, you would probably die. And since there's only, under 20 beds in that greater Washington area, burn beds, specialized burn beds, most of which would probably almost certainly have been destroyed, the chances of you getting any help are nothing. So those people, those victims suffer, the most horrific death. But you are absolutely correct that, reading this is difficult. Writing it was difficult. I keep it short, but let's go to the most important fundamental here. These are not facts made up in Annie Jacobsen's mind. These are reported facts from Defense Department documents. And anyone who wants to nerd out on this can go to my footnotes, all 100 pages of them. And I write longer, sort of narratives in there. For example, I explain that the effects of nuclear weapons, these books that have been compiled by the Defense Department and the Atomic Energy Commission back during the early days of the Cold War, began when they studied the effects secretly of the victims of the atomic bombings, much, much smaller weapons, at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they expanded from there as these weapons tests. Most people don't even really know this. We exploded more than 200 atmospheric weapons. Russia did the same. But we were doing them in the Marshall Islands. I had the great fortune of interviewing early weapons engineers who wired these bombs and who told me what they looked like from firsthand. We're talking 50 miles away with welder's glasses on. And we're actually chronicling these effects to learn what nuclear weapons do to people and to things at certain distances out, right? So like, as I report in the book, something like 7 or 8 miles out, the Defense Department now knows a certain type of upholstery in a certain type of car explodes. And at another distance, pine needles will explode. And at 13 miles out, people looking directly at the bomb will go blind. And by the way, this varies if you're talking about a 300 kiloton weapon or a 1 megaton weapon. I give the reader information in bits and in anecdotes, but I can tell you from having done the reporting, thousands of pages exist on these grotesque concepts. And this is underpinning the book with this idea of, my God, people should know about this. This is, to borrow a 21st century word, bananas.
It is. It's at the insanity of this and the idea that anyone in power might have that they think that they could win or survive something like this. I mean, what I think that, I can remember, in reading in various Cold War histories, leaders in the US and in Russia talking about the potential survivability of a nuclear strike, which, as I think you lay out in such a compelling way, the cascading effects of this and the compression of time in which people have to make decisions and the way that information will be fundamentally misinterpreted, it seems like it all but just guarantees this is the end of civilization as we know it. This is not, a few cities in the US get blown up and it's really terrible, but then we crawl out of the ashes. And yet here we are talking about this and people drilling for it every day, and you just want to scream reading this stuff.
I was doing a radio program the other day with some interviewers in Wales, and they were like, we thought we'd be safe because we're so far away, and after reading your book, we're like, oh no, right? And it's not funny. And I only say that with a sort of, it's just shocking to have reported all of this. And the fundamental reason for me writing this book was to show in appalling detail just how horrific nuclear war would be. Because I believe that has an impact on people. And I'll refer here to an earlier podcast you did that I listened to about the 1983 television film The Day After, which I saw as a high school student and was, horrified by. And it really got me thinking. And of course, I was in no position to take any action when I was a high school student, but boy, was I happy to learn that President Reagan did, and that he watched the film and he, as he said publicly, he became depressed. And because he was president, he turned his depression into action. He partnered up with Gorbachev. And ultimately, the insane nuclear arsenals that reached 70,000 weapons in the 1980s have now been reduced to 12,500 approximately. So you might say that's 12,500 too many, but my goodness, it's a big difference from 70,000.
Yeah, it's a huge step back from where we were. And of course, you think, my God, what would we have ever done with 70,000 weapons? I mean, but I think that's a really important point. And the day after, I mean, one of the things that I think people find so compelling about that film, and I certainly did, is as the name implies, it talks about what comes later. And you write a lot about this in the book too. And you have this quote, and it's escaping me who said it, but it's someone famous who said that, in the aftermath of this, the living will envy the dead,
That's right.
because what we're talking about that comes after is nothing like what we understand. We're talking about the end of human civilization as we know it. We'll skip ahead, and I want to come back to something, but just give people an understanding, just so we're clear about this, of why this is not hyperbole. I mean, what physically happens to the planet after
Mm.
you have had a full exchange of nuclear weapons between Russia and the United States.
Back in the 1980s, a group of 5 scientists authored a paper called Nuclear Winter. And one of those scientists was Carl Sagan, famously, and another was his student, his then student, now Professor Brian Toon, whom I had the great fortune of interviewing for the book, who took me through all the questions that you just asked me. I asked him, and introduced me to colleagues, because that's how reporting works. Find out from Alan Robach about this and that. And you begin to learn what nuclear winter really means. In 1983, the Defense Department's position was, that's Soviet propaganda. And it was interesting because the authors of the Nuclear Winter paper, humble as they were, conceded that their modeling was all analog, right? This is back in the day when people used, slide rulers for things. But what is shocking is that now state-of-the-art climate modeling, because Toon and others have stayed on this issue in the decades since, state-of-the-art climate modeling indicates that nuclear winter is in fact worse than they had originally calculated. So the metric that they use is after all the nuclear weapons launch, and in my scenario, there's basically, well, we won't give it away, right? But after the ones that launch, 300 billion tons of 300 billion pounds of soot gets lofted into the air. That is because all the nuclear weapons create these megafires that burn and burn and burn. They burn down cities. They burn down, forests, peat bogs, burning, burning, burning. Soot goes into the air, and the sunlight becomes blocked out. And so the scientific calculation is that 70% of the sunlight is gone for up to 10 years. And the planet experiences this incredible temperature plunge, approximately 40 degrees Fahrenheit lower. So, as Professor Toon explained to me in very specific terms, places like Iowa and Ukraine, these sort of agricultural breadbaskets, just become frozen over for almost a decade. And so what you have is the failure of agriculture. And then even more gruesome, imagine the thawing out that happens afterwards, with hundreds of millions of bodies that have been that were frozen, decomposing. And that's where Toon uses the analogy of the asteroid striking Earth 66 million years ago, which wiped out something like 70-80% of all species, including all of the dinosaurs. And he likens what would happen to the Earth after nuclear war and nuclear winter, very similar to that, and that humans would have an incredibly difficult time surviving. And so, as Carl Sagan warned 40 years ago, the likelihood is that humans would return to their hunter-gatherer state. And when you think about that as a metaphor, or you just say, wow, I mean, you know, man created all of these magnificent technological advances that you and I both benefit from, we all benefit from. And to think that one of them would end us and return us, wipe out all the progress, is just such a puzzle that is most definitely worth contemplating.
Yeah. And of course, as you write, you spend a lot of time detailing in the book the decision to unleash these weapons, rests in the hands of a vanishingly small number of people. Of course, the president has the authority in the United States to release them. In Russia, the president also has that authority. One thing I was fascinated by is you always write that the commander of Stratcom, this all-important organization we've been talking about, also can end up with the authority to launch nuclear weapons, which I think is something that most people will find surprising. So say a little bit about how it is that this military officer could come up with or ultimately have the authority to launch these weapons, and how would that play out?
That's right. Um, and again, thank you for that careful read of the book, because, you're zooming along in this ticking clock scenario. And, I do insert these moments of reportage that shocked even me when I learned them. And you're talking about one of them, which is, so first of all, the fact that the United States president has sole authority to launch nuclear weapons is also erroneously debated by people. And this came up on very much in the public sort of mindset when President Trump was using a lot of rhetoric about fire and fury. And so Congress did a quick report and released it and stated, yes, the president has sole authority to launch nuclear weapons. It's inherent in his position as commander in chief. He doesn't need to ask the Secretary of Defense. He doesn't need to ask the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he doesn't need to ask Congress. And so what you've pointed out here is that what the role that becomes incredibly important in this moment is the Stratcom commander, because the Stratcom commander is, short version, in charge of nukes. And so in normal circumstances, when the president gives the launch order, he gives a very precise launch order that is chosen out of the black book, which sits inside the nuclear football, that sort of leather satchel that the military aide to the president carries around, always within arm's length of the president. And the president chooses which weapons to launch. As it was said to me, if he chooses to launch 82 weapons, only 82 weapons are going to get launched, not 83. Right? And from reporting on NSA that the launch codes are these incredibly encrypted, profound, I'm talking about the development of them, right? That occur way in the back rooms of things, and there's a lot of bureaucracy involved. Okay. So under a normal circumstance, if the president launched weapons and then something were to happen to the president, imagine the bureaucracy involved to be able to give that authority, A, to the new commander in chief, and B, a new set of launch codes. And so a situation exists inside nuclear command and control that we know about thanks to a missileer, a former missile launch officer turned sort of world's expert on nuclear weapons, worked at the Princeton Security Center for Nuclear Weapons. His name was Bruce Blair, and he explains to us how there is something called the Universal Unlock Code, which is very much like it sounds. And if the president gives that universal unlock code authority to the Stratcom commander can make decisions while the president is missing. That opens up a whole set of new dramas that I write about in the book.
Yeah. Yeah. And one reads this and imagines, this must be something that they're drilling on all the time and that they're preparing for and they're thinking about. But I was struck by you found some declassified documents redacted to within an inch of their life, I should say, from 1983 about a war game called Proud Prophet, which, among other things, revealed that the military leadership was, as you write, wholly unprepared for the decisions that they were going to have to make from the initial spark of nuclear war to the last breath any of them would take. And it struck me that, I mean, this is something that they are in theory thinking about, that they're training for, and yet these war games, now granted this was in 1983, maybe things have changed, but showed them to basically be not ready for this. And I don't know if anybody could, but I mean, has this changed? I mean, the people you talk to in the military, when you ask them, I mean, do you know what you need to do? Are you prepared for what you need to do? What do they say?
The most interesting answer to that question came from my interview with former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta. Now, Panetta has an extraordinarily unique position in American military history in that he was also the director of the CIA, and before that, he was the White House chief of staff. And so Panetta wore these different hats, all extremely close to the President of the United States. But what he explained to me was only when he became SecDef did he really understand the weight of the nuclear command and control possibility, the nuclear war possibility that rested on his shoulders, not as a decision maker, but as a direct advisor to the president. Almost certainly the president looks to his SecDef for advice. And it was from that interview where it really confirmed interviews I had done with people who were less close to the president, shall we say, who all kind of echoed this idea that the president doesn't really know much about what would happen in a nuclear war. It's not in his purview, meaning, and Panetti even said, for example, when he was chief of staff, President Clinton was worried about many other domestic problems. And again, deterrence will hold. That's what we're all told. That's what the president is most likely thinking, based on my reporting and interviews with people very close to the president. No president since Kennedy is saying, take me through these scenarios. Let me know what I would have to do. And that is also very frightening, because in this sort of ticking clock scenario that happens literally, truly in a nuclear war scenario, another remarkable situation which I came across was a situation called jamming the president. That is kind of an understood idea that could potentially happen within the military command and control were the president have to launch a counterattack, that the military officers are much more inclined to respond with a lot of force. That there is this idea of what's called escalate to de-escalate, which is so Orwellian that you can almost not even wrap your head around it. But it's this idea, General Hyten was quoted once as saying, and this was during the Fire and Fury rhetoric, General Hyten, Stratcom commander, he said, and I'm paraphrasing, but you can see the incredible interview that Barbara Starr did with him for CNN. If North Korea sends one, they need to know we will send one nuclear weapon. If they send two, we'll send two. Well, in my reporting, I had a number of people on the record say to me, that's not really accurate. It's more like, if they send one, we send 82.
Yeah, it's chilling, and you see precisely in the book how that becomes this cascade of horribles. You mentioned that presidents have relied on the idea that deterrence as a strategy is going to keep all of this from happening. And I'd love to know, after you've done all this research and read the book, do you think deterrence is a viable strategy?
I can't stop thinking about that Lieutenant General Bussier comment, the deputy Stratcom commander, who said, if deterrence fails, it all unravels.
Mm-hmm.
That unraveling is so all or nothing that it's impossible for someone like me, after reporting this book, to accept that the psychological phenomena of deterrence, because that's all it is, that the psychological phenomena of deterrence will hold. Because, as I also report, nuclear command and control is a system of systems. There are 150,000 Stratcom employees right below the Stratcom director in the chain of command, waiting on his word, right? So it's a system, and all systems fail. I've reported about this in my earlier books. We know machines break down. And so it's a machine made up of machines. We haven't begun to talk about the nuclear triad. People can learn about that in the book. Bombers, ICBMs, nuclear submarines. That's it, right? There are so many weapons ready for launch. America has 1,770 nuclear weapons pointed at the other side. Russia has 1,674 nuclear weapons ready to launch, pointed at the other side. The numbers change incrementally every year, okay? Thanks to the people who keep track of them at the Federation of American Scientists. But these are important, because then you begin to realize, a large part of those arsenals, the ICBMs, can be launched within 60 seconds. Subs take about 14 minutes to launch. This is the precipice. This is the razor's edge. Do we really want to live like this?
Yeah. Because we have to contemplate this now so much more at the front of our minds, not the back of them, because of what Putin has done in Ukraine and the threat that he has made to use tactical nuclear weapons. Just take a moment and talk about what you're thinking when you hear him say that. And do you think that his use of a tactical nuclear weapon would trigger the same kind of cascades as we're talking about, where you write about in your book, where you're writing about so-called strategic nuclear weapons? I mean, to put it very clumsily, like really, really big nukes as opposed to nukes with a very much smaller blast yield.
That's right. And I'm talking about ballistic missiles,
Yes.
and they get where they're going really fast. And those decisions are made metaphorically with a button push, a turnkey, right? Whereas tactical nuclear weapons are battlefield nukes. And I do not have any of them in my scenario, specifically for the reason that that's a super politically charged situation with a lot of lead up, as exactly like you're talking about. With that said, I'll refer back to the proud prophet scenario, right? Which, as you said, is like, it makes a mockery of redaction, because you can barely see any words. There's so much black ink on those documents. But what proud prophets quote unquote declassification did was allowed certain people to talk about it, like Professor Paul Bracken. And that allows people like me and you to learn about it, right? And what we learned from the proud prophet, because Bracken was a participant in it, and because it was so classified, he could never say anything until it was declassified. Then he had the liberty of actually speaking about it again. You and I know about reporting. This is how reportage works. He can take us up to the edge of what can be known, and that's super valuable for the public. And what we learn from Bracken is that he learned in this proud prophet scenario, which went on for 2 weeks and involved multiple scenarios, right? Like, okay, for example, it was a war scenario with NATO involved, with a nuclear war scenario when NATO didn't get involved, with China involved, all these different scenarios. And what Bracken said, why everyone left so horrified, was because no matter how nuclear war started, it ended in nuclear Armageddon.
So we should not be assuming that if Putin launches a tactical nuclear weapon, that is a contained situation. We should presume that this spirals into something catastrophic.
Is this a risk anyone wants to take?
Right.
And, the solution must be communication, because that's all it can be at this point. And when you look at what Reagan and Gorbachev did, you have a perfect footprint for the ability for so-called enemy nations to have a dialogue and disentangle from, throwing stones at one another, right? Because the risks are just far too great. I mean, think about that idea of low probability, high consequence event. And that's what I think when I hear the rhetoric about Putin with a tactical nuclear weapon. It's like, low probability? Will he really? Low probability, but high consequence.
Right, right. And I even worry it's a low to moderate probability given the way he's talking. And what do you make of the news in the past couple of weeks that the U.S. intelligence community thinks that Putin has designs on placing a nuclear weapon of some kind in space, possibly an anti-satellite weapon? Of course, it could be an EMP weapon, which would be
Mhm.
horrific as well. What do you make of that?
And as you know from the book, that gets brought up in Act 3, right? Because it's a horrific scenario. It's a very legitimate, technologically possible scenario. Richard Garwin wrote the first paper on that very subject back in the early 50s for Los Alamos. It's still classified. Another person I interviewed for the book, General Toohill, who was Obama's cyber chief and actually America's first cyber chief, also wrote a paper on this in the 80s. It's still classified. There is no doubt that that is a very, very serious threat. I do note that a number of journalists and also pundits, people with PhDs who study nuclear weapons, have taken the position that this is hyperbole or fear mongering. It would never happen. I disagree based on the interviews that I did. I had to really drill down on that section of the book because those individuals who are seriously concerned about someone like Putin putting a weapon in space, for whatever reason, had over the decades, because they've been reporting on this almost since right after 9/11, an EMP commission was created. Those individuals got sort of called, hawks by other elements of the media. And I think that it caused a lot of reporters to form opinions that they might not want to back off of. That's just my viewpoint on it. What I do report in the book is what would happen were a nuclear weapon to be detonated in space based on interviews, with like military people, and the defense, the reduction, the agencies that are sort of the follow on to the Manhattan Project that look at look at countering this kind of thing. And this is a very, very, very serious threat. And so again, it's posturing, it's saber rattling. How would we? There would also be no way to determine if that weapon, if what was in space was a weapon or just a satellite with radio technology, metaphorically but also literally, right? Which is so. It's a really tricky posturing conundrum that I believe is not worth fighting over, but rather must be communicated through.
Yeah, yeah, and I was struck by your treatment of the EMP threat as well, because you're right. I mean, it's a branch of national security where people who fear the EMP, they're often very insistent and fervent about it, and it takes on a little bit of an almost kind of quality of it's easy to ignore them, and they seem kind of fringy. And I have to say, like I read your book and I thought I need to be not so dismissive about this as my own reporting as well. And I thought that was a really well done section, and particularly now that Putin appears to be contemplating such a device, I think it is something we all have to take more seriously. And in the few minutes we have left, I don't want to leave people on this horribly, down note. So I wanted to take a moment just to ask you about you. We talked at the beginning that you've been reporting on all these just fascinating aspects and secretive, often very secretive aspects of national security. I mean, you've written about Area 51, you've written about paramilitary operations, you've been a Pulitzer Prize finalist for your work. How did you get into this? I mean, it's the question that everyone always loves to ask a national security journalist, like, how did a nice person like you end up in a place like this?
I was born a storyteller. I must have been. I went to high school. I went to a boarding school so I was 15 years old, and I literally was carrying a typewriter along. Back in the days when we had typewriters. I am dating myself. But that said, I always knew that writing was for me. And like many writers, struggled with finding readers all the way until I was in my 30s when I became a reporter kind of by default, right? Someone had suggested to me that maybe it would be wise for me to work with an editor and learn how to follow direction. That was what was actually said to me, which I pass along, right? Because in your youth, you think you know everything. No, 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 no. And then you learn, wow, why don't I learn from the elder statesmen? And then my whole world changed. I loved being a reporter. And one thing led to another. And ultimately, I got a lucky break, like so many reporters, and again, it's what you interpret as your lucky break. I encourage people to be optimistic about their writing, right? Like see things in front of you as, wow, that could be great for me. And then, so how did I become a national security reporter? My God, is it drama, right?
Yep.
People want to be compelled to read on. People have busy lives. I have a friend who teaches writing, and she's like, it's that or the laundry, and it's like, it's such a simple truth, right?
Yeah.
Or as my husband says, you got to be able to read it at the beach.
Yeah.
Now, the subjects I write about, for whatever reason, they're so dark and potentially horrifying, but for me, it's the opposite of the ostrich in the sand. There's something really excellent about having information, treating it objectively, keeping the mind open to what I might not know. And then the fundamental for me is always, it should lead toward the ability to communicate.
Yeah.
It's why I have so many readers on both sides of the aisle. You're not getting my opinion, you're getting the facts from history, and in this case, hopefully not the facts from the future.
And you've had a chance to do writing in fiction as well, right? You've produced and written for Jack Ryan, the series. I mean,
That's right.
What's it been like to take the journalistic part of your brain and then apply that to the fiction narrative storyteller?
I mean, it's super exciting. Right now, HBO is doing my book, Surprise, Kill, Vanish, about the CIA's paramilitary.
Yeah.
And I and the producers have been working with the incredibly talented director, Joe Kosinski, who is the sort of director of the show. He directed, Maverick, Top Gun Maverick. And so you're mixing this idea of story, you're mixing the historical record, you're mixing technology, and you're mixing drama in the case of TV, it's audiences, but there is a crossover with readers, of course. And so the nonfiction hat and the fiction hat go hand in hand and ultimately help me as an author, as a writer, become more like caring about craft. And I think that being a TV writer really helped me with the architecture of the nuclear war, a scenario book. As you pointed out, you said it read like a thriller, and that I learned from TV. What a weird thing that you have to you realize people have an attention span.
Yes.
Like it or not, this is truth. And if you're a writer like me who really wants people to read her books, then it becomes very inspiring to be always learning new techniques to thread through the reporting.
Yeah, I love that, and I am a nut for structure, and there is
Yes.
nothing like screenwriting for structure. I mean, it is just like it is. It has to be economical. It has to be compelling. It has to move the plot forward, and it's no, but like now I can see how this is translated into the new book
Hmm.
because you're seeing it happen in your head as it's going along. It's one of the things that makes it such a compulsive read, which is terrific. Yeah.
It's also interesting how there used to be a bit of a sort of looking down on someone who wrote that wore dual hats, shall we say,
Mm-hmm.
right? But if your point is, and my point as a reporter is to bring the information to the people, to inform the public, right? Then if you're someone like me, you go and you see Top Gun Maverick, which, by the way, was adored by the Air Force pilots I know, even though they geek out well, he got this tiny detail wrong.
Yeah.
Joe Kaczynski did a bang up job
Yeah.
impressing Air Force pilots, Navy pilots. I talked to an astronaut who was impressed, right? So
Nice.
then you begin to realize, let's all do our craft to the best of our ability and also have a commitment to even doing it a little better. I have young boys, and we're not young, they're in college, but they're not grown up yet. And when I see how they absorb news, how they absorb information, and how they have an inkling toward being able to parse out the difference between fiction and nonfiction. Um, it's not just, grandpa who reads the newspaper anymore.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That is a really important component of today's society. And I want to be part of making information more accessible to people and making people feel more at home reading something that might otherwise feel intimidating to them.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that about Top Gun Maverick, but to say that there were real professionals who were impressed by it, because I think I think people should understand that, a lot of people who are making, who are in Hollywood and who are making popular fiction, maybe not all, but a lot of them are trying to portray things in the most realistic fashion that they can. I mean, yes, you have to have dramatic license to move a plot along, but to really like watch a movie and feel like you've learned something from it is great. So that's excellent that he took that level of care, such that real pros looked at it and went, "Oh yeah, this is good stuff."
I'm going to give you one final point to loop it back to nuclear war on a
Yeah,
positive note, right?
please.
Which is actually the Oppenheimer effect. And I'm talking
Mm,
about the film, Christopher Nolan's brilliant film. Having reported on nuclear weapons for 15 years now, I've always previously gotten the sense from Los Alamos, and I'd been there many times, of like, keep the distance from the reporter. And that changed after Oppenheimer.
mm,
And as readers can note in my notes, the footnotes in the back of my book, many documents came from Los Alamos. And I found the historians there to be extraordinarily transparent to a
mm,
degree which they weren't before. For example, there's new original reporting in the book about the president's football,
mm.
right? That satchel he carries. It's always been super mysterious to anyone reporting on the subject. The information is very limited. Los Alamos declassified for the book the origin story of how the president's football came to be. And that is a win for the public, because the more we know, the more questions we get to ask.
Yeah. And hopefully the less likely this scenario is to come to pass. Um, well, very quickly, our tradition here is that the last question on Chatters, I reach into the chatter box, which I have here, and I select for you a question written previously. I selected at random. I got to say, I know the questions that are in this box, and any number of them could be very good for you. Okay, this is one that I was actually hoping you might get. There's actually a nuclear weapons one in here, but we didn't get that one. If you could convince the president to take one discrete action today related to national security, what would it be?
Pick up the phone and call Putin.
Yeah. Yeah. What would you want them to talk
Period.
about? Talk
Period.
about anything.
Let's get together and have a cup of coffee, not tea.
Be a very useful phone call, I think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Annie Jacobsen, this has been a delight. It's so nice to get to talk to you finally and to do it at length. Thank you for your work. Thank you for this book, Nuclear War, a Scenario. People should read it. It's a tremendous piece of work. And I'm really grateful that you came on to talk about it.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter @ThatWasChatter.